Previously on this channel, we discussed the Japanese version of Spider-Man, that is, the TV show version. We took a deep dive into the series and what it was all about, and explained that it's kind of a shame that Takuya has mostly faded into obscurity because he's massively important to the history of Super Sentai, Power Rangers, and other franchises that they inspired. There's been a bit of a renewed interest in the last few years thanks to the Disney 616 documentary and his appearance in some of the Spider-Verse comics, but most people have forgotten about him. The thing is though, there are actually two other versions of Spider-Man in Japan that preceded the 1978 show. There's the 1970 manga, focused on a completely different character called Yukimori, and while we can talk about that in another video, there's one other version that is arguably even more curious. And that's because it's the American Spider-Man's first appearance in Japan, and that is the 1976 Playboy version. And straight away, I know what you're thinking, he doesn't mean that Playboy. But I do. And also I don't. It's a little hard to explain because I'm actually not an expert on Japanese porn. Perhaps some of my viewers are more well read on the subject, but basically, in Japan in the 70s, there were two versions of Playboy, both of which were put out by the same publisher. The magazine that was referred to as Monthly Playboy was just the localized version of the American magazine, whereas the magazine referred to as Weekly Playboy was more akin to what we might call a lads mag. They both acknowledged each other, but were essentially different publications. Even so, this is particularly interesting because it's one of those oddities that is somewhat known about on the internet, but only really by true die-hard Spider-Man fans, and for the most part, no one has dived headfirst into all the mysteries it contains, because getting a hold of a copy of the required issues is almost impossible. Not just because they're from Japan, but more so because these were fairly disposable magazines to begin with. Most probably weren't keeping them like they might do their comics, and then some may have been used in a slightly different context, shall we say. So we can't really expect them to have been kept in the same manner as vintage comic collecting. However, Weekly Playboy still exists. I can't show you much of the content here for obvious reasons, but as far as I can tell, they've been pumping out weekly editions since 1966. Imagine trying to find a very specific issue of Nuts or Zoo in 50 years' time. And for those outside of the UK or anyone under 30 wondering what Nuts or Zoo are, exactly. So much so that you can expect to pay a minimum of $300 per issue for the required magazines, and there's 11 of them. Clearly I can't afford to spend $3 grand on some old copies of a Japanese gentleman's special interest literature. Fortunately though, we live in a digital age, so I can also get digital copies. Except, I can't. Because of course I can't. The magazine has been publishing weekly for 60 years. There is no digital archive for Weekly Playboy, at least not that stretches all the way back to 1970s. As far as I can tell, no one has ever fully digitally preserved all of the Spider-Man Playboy issues. Never mind the fact that the moment people catch on to the idea that these very specific 11 issues are important to Spider-Man history, they're sending them off to be locked away in graded comics cases and charging up to $3,000 just for the first appearance. Well, I say no. Consider this video the most thorough archive of the Playboy Spider-Man that currently exists on the internet. I'm aware that there are some niche collectors out there that have a lot of them, but I'm here to outdo even them. I'm going to talk you through all 11 issues, and I'm going to tell you where they came from too. Before we start though, just a little explanation of how this video is possible. No, I didn't buy any issues of Weekly Playboy. What I did do is spend an entire week trawling through listings on eBay, Japanese Yahoo auctions, Japanese Amazon, some other auction sites, and just about any website I could find that has ever sold a copy of each required magazine, and piece by piece I managed to put together an entire picture of the series. The images have all been freely shared on public listings, so thanks to fair use, I am able to share them with you here. They're not all perfect, but I think they're complete. Slight side note, I don't actually read Japanese, so I've had to rely on a mix of Google Translate and ChatGPT to understand much of the comic panels. which may not always be accurate, but that's where I have to say a special thank you to Mandala and Giratina Musics on my Discord, who helped sense check some of them. But to give you an example of how AI can be tricky, on this page, in which the text is fairly clear, Google translated it as, "What's wrong? What's the reason for this?" However, on pages where the quality of the image isn't as good, the translations were vastly different. For instance, the same page, although a little blurrier, was also translated by Google as, "What's wrong? Are you wearing a dick?" How am I meant to know which one is correct? It's from Playboy. I have no prior context. Maybe these are raunchy Spider-Man comics, I don't know, it could be either of them. So take my retelling of the story with a pinch of salt. Right. With those little disclaimers out of the way, we can talk about the magazines themselves. Specifically, we're talking about issues 31, July of 1976, to 41, released in October of the same year. And yes, that's 11, not 10, even though this is technically a 10-issue run. Issue 31 features an advertisement of the upcoming arrival of the American Spider-Man and an article that contains quotes from an interview with Stan Lee. It also features one of the best summaries of why Spider-Man is loved. It says, "Superheroes in American comics often reflect the desires of their readers. Superman, the icon of heroism, is powerful, righteous and invincible. On the other hand, Spider-Man is different. His powers come with struggle, self-doubt and real-life problems. Unlike traditional heroes who possess absolute power and righteousness, Spider-Man is portrayed as a character who constantly faces moral dilemmas and doubts about his own actions. This is one of the reasons why readers are drawn to his story, his humanity. Unlike Captain America, Spider-Man is not a perfectly righteous figure. He's just an ordinary young man who was granted special powers unexpectedly." That's exactly right, something that Power Rangers should have lent more into with its characters. The writer also mentions that one of his articles from 1968 was the first time anything about Spider-Man was published in Japan, and yeah, that even precedes the Japanese manga too. Now, I'm not sure where that article is, I've tried searching for it but I can't find it anywhere. However, given the small time gap, I'm assuming it was also in Weekly Playboy. But you see, this is where it gets a little confusing, because in the American translation of the manga, it includes an interview in a book from one Gene Pelk, the guy who brought Spider-Man to Japan. He talks about trying to sell Spider-Man into the Japanese market. He mentions that he was struggling to find a willing publisher, but finally found one in the Shueisha Publishing Company. It doesn't mention, though, that that is the publisher of Weekly Playboy. He says, "I found a fellow there who happened to have read a lot of Spider-Man comics, who was in a position to do something. He thought the time was right for American comics, and especially for Spider-Man. He proposed to run Spider-Man for a 10-week stint during the summer to see the reaction. If it was good, then they would publish Spidey as a regular title." With this, he's talking here about the 10 issues of Playboy, issues 32 to 41, but things didn't work out. He continues, "We translated it and ran it for 10 weeks, but at the end of 8 weeks they gave me the Japanese version of the Raspberry. The thing didn't go. There was just no reaction, it was not a success." In other interviews he stated that this was because Playboy wasn't the right place for it. People were buying it for pictures of the lovely ladies, not for Spider-Man. But that's not strictly true, because Weekly Playboy also ran manga throughout. It was a staple for the magazine, as far as I can tell in my limited experience. Again, I haven't trawled through all 60 years of its back catalogue, but I would, and I'd do it all for you. The issue is that the Japanese audience weren't really interested in American comic styles. But regardless, the failure of Spider-Man in Playboy is what led to him looking for other options, and that's what led to the conceptualization of the Japanese TV show. You see? It's all connected. If Playboy had been a success, then we may never have got the TV show, and who knows what effect that would have had on Super Sentai and eventually Power Rangers. So yes, you have the Japanese Weekly Playboy to thank for Power Rangers and for this channel. The genesis of this channel was softcore porn all along. That's a better twist than half of M. Night Shyamalan's movies. The complication with that narrative, though, is the manga itself. that's always listed as being from 1970, 6 years prior to the Weekly Playboy run and 8 years prior to the TV show. So the chronology is a bit strange here to have that story included about the comics and the TV show when they were both after the manga, but now included in the manga. But then again, the official English translations of the manga also don't include all the issues because it was too mature, so it gets really messy and honestly deserves its own deep dive. Incidentally, Gene, Mr. Pelk, on the off chance that you're watching this, I'd love to interview you, even over a video call, as I still have a lot of questions and would love to clarify a few things. But anyway, back to Playboy. Not something I thought I'd ever say on this channel, but there you go. It's when we get to issue 32 that we get Spidey's actual debut. This is the issue that everybody wants, including me, the golden issue from the 27th of July 1976, featuring this rather lovely lady on the cover, who would probably be around my mother's age at this point. While Yukimori may have been the first, this is the first appearance of Peter Parker's Spider-Man in Japan. But you may be wondering, are these comics exclusive to Japan? And not really. It would be amazing if they were, but it's not that simple. It's a bit tricky because it's not like they just took the first issues of the American comics and then just translated them and reprinted them as supplements in the issues of Playboy. They picked bits and pieces from all over the place. The story with the Human Torch, which we'll get onto, was probably the hardest to pin down. I searched through every issue of The Amazing Spider-Man and Spectacular Spider-Man that contained the Human Torch, and none of them related to the comic featured in Playboy. So where the hell did it come from? After a lot of searching, I finally found it. It's from The Amazing Spider-Man Annual number 4 from 1967, and the reason why it was so hard to find was A, because the comic itself boasts all new, not a single reprint, so this story was exclusive to this annual and isn't part of the chronology of the main series, and 2, it seemed like this issue was never officially digitised separately, so it was impossible to find on its own. Fortunately, after more searching, I managed to find out that it was also included in an anthology collection at one point, and that has been digitised, so we can take a look at the American pages in more detail. And D, because AI constantly kept telling me that it's from the manga, which it's not. But even though that is taken from The Amazing Spider-Man, sort of, issue 32's retelling of Peter Parker's transformation is taken from the Spectacular Spider-Man magazine from 1968. Initially I thought this could have been a reprint from somewhere else, as the magazine seems to not be a collection of stories, but it's not from Amazing Fantasy, and you won't find it anywhere in Amazing Spider-Man either. The story starts with Uncle Ben's funeral and begins to chronicle how Peter Parker became Spider-Man. As a student, he attends an experiment where a spider is exposed to radiation. Before dying, it bites Peter, and almost immediately he begins showing signs of superhuman strength, even being able to support his own weight on his fingertips. Initially, he just mentions that he wants to study these new powers, but then gets to work on a costume and a special spray adhesive that resembles spider webbing. He doesn't really know what to do with the powers, but plans to earn money to help his Uncle Ben and Aunt May. He could become part of the circus, or he could even make his debut on TV. The whole story feels quite rushed, but it does actually say on the side of the page that they needed to summarise the story due to the page limitations, which is something that they also included on the American comic, even though it's longer and more detailed. On his way to the Ed Sullivan Show, he encounters a thief, but ignores him, and he goes on to his TV debut in search of fame. Afterwards, he returns home to find out that Uncle Ben was shot by an escaping thief, now hiding in a warehouse. He quickly changes into his costume and goes after the shooter, and he realises it's the same man that he ignored on the way to the TV studio and feels that it's his fault. He realises that with great power comes great responsibility and devotes himself to using his newfound powers for good. The reason why it feels a bit rushed is because this isn't a direct translation of the American comic. It's a story that has been condensed down from 8 pages to just 8, but more importantly, there's just nowhere near as much text in this version. Japanese comics at this point were more action focused, and American ones were more text heavy. While the pages are similar, the American comic provides more context and more dialogue. There are also panels that are completely cut from the Japanese adaptation, which aren't technically necessary, but it does little to immerse the reader into the story. In fact, an entire page is cut where Peter gets into a fight and is shocked by his own speed and strength, even breaking a lamppost in half. He continues to develop his web shooters and his costume with the aim of becoming a star. After his TV debut, he returns home to find out that Uncle Ben has been killed and the killer is holed up in an old warehouse. And then another page is cut that explains that the killer is strategically hidden in the warehouse to hold off the police, but there's no hiding from Spider-Man. After disarming the man, he realises that it's the same man who killed Uncle Ben, and the whole story wraps up in the same way. So it turns out that it's nothing revolutionary, it's simply a condensed version of the American story. Some bits are cut, panels are flipped to better suit reading panels from right to left, and what was black and white is now black, white and red. The reason why it's so hard to find in the first place is because it's actually a retelling of Spider-Man's origin from Amazing Fantasy number 15. Some of the panels are similar, but not the same. And indeed, the original telling is longer, as is mentioned in both the Japanese and the American version, and it includes scenes that you'd recognise from later adaptations. The Japanese adaptation is taken from the updated and shortened version from Spectacular Spider-Man magazine, as it was presumably easier to copy the artwork over and was simplified anyway. And that basically sets the precedent for the rest of the issues. The only real difference is that the first issue is self-contained, whereas the following weeks are serialised. Issue 33 begins the story of Spider-Man and the Human Torch. Rather than Spectacular Spider-Man, as mentioned, this is taken from the Amazing Spider-Man Annual and spans issues 33 to 37 of Playboy. For this story, I'll go through the more detailed American version and juxtapose the Japanese story so you can see the differences. In the first part of the serial, it seems like the Human Torch, of the Fantastic Four, has turned evil and is destroying the city. Spider-Man intervenes and a battle ensues, only for a director to call cut, as it turns out it was all a big misunderstanding, and that they were actually making a movie about the Human Torch and Spider-Man simply misunderstood, thinking it was real. Upon hearing of the mistake, a mysterious stranger hatches a plan, while J. Jonah Jameson is in heaven, having had Spider-Man make a fool of himself. It's announced on the news that following the incident, a new production company now wants to make a movie featuring both Spider-Man and the Human Torch. Again, the Japanese version is shorter, with much less dialogue. In fact, a lot of context is lost. It goes immediately from Spider-Man ruined the take to maybe we could use this. A lot of the back and forth with witty nicknames is lost too, and surprisingly, it's the American version that uses the term pull a boner, whilst the Playboy version cuts it. Surely someone doing the translations would have been tempted to keep that in. Issue 34 has a quick recap of the last issue, and then gets back to the story as it is in the American comic. 6 months have gone by and Spider-Man has arrived in Hollywood. He makes an appointment with the producers, but bumps into the Human Torch on the way. They call a truce as they're both meant to be starring in the film together, but it doesn't sound like the most well-written script in the world. They start shooting a scene that involves a spaceship landing in Central Park. Spider-Man is meant to be the voice of reason, but the Human Torch is being hot-headed, pun intended, and attacks without thinking. When it comes to shooting the scene again from a different angle, Spider-Man's Peter Tingle is going crazy, and he's nearly burned as the Human Torch misses his cue and heads straight for him. We then move on to issue 35, but before we do, just a side note, I love the little dated detail that Spider-Man's webs are actually made from asbestos. In fact, that actually comes up quite a lot. In issue 35, again we get a brief recap, and then back to the Human Torch causing chaos on set. But something is odd about him, his movements seem different, and after crashing through a reflector, he flies away. Spider-Man goes to his trailer and rips open to find the torch inside. We then cut to the offices of the producers and find another Human Torch, which is actually the Wizard in a flame jet and asbestos suit with Mysterio. It was the Wizard that we'd seen earlier in the American comic listening to the news, but not in the Japanese version. He'd seen the story about the original movie mix-up and set up the studio to trick Spider-Man and the Human Torch into a trap that he had planned, and brought in Mysterio to make it happen. We then cut back to Spider-Man fighting the real Human Torch. It spills out onto the set, and Spider-Man uses an asbestos curtain to douse the flames, but he's able to shake it loose and flame on again. Issue 36 starts with the Wizard and Mysterio watching in hopes of Spider-Man and the Human Torch destroying each other, but the Wizard jumps the gun and fires a laser at them. Once they discover what is happening, a ring is lowered to shoot gas at the heroes, but Spider-Man is able to block the gas nozzles with his web fluid. Quite a few panels are then cut, but essentially Spider-Man and the Human Torch then launch into a counterattack to find out who's behind all this. But they use a mirage created by Mysterio to escape, with our heroes in pursuit, making their way to a jungle set, with Spider-Man jumping into the undergrowth to rely on his spidey sense to find them, before wrapping up with a loud thumping sound. As we get to issue 37, we realise that the thumping sound is coming from a legally different, mechanical version of a giant gorilla that is definitely not King Kong. Although the Japanese version seems to have some unique, or perhaps unused, artwork for the recap page, it doesn't seem to appear in the American version at all. The ape is being controlled by the Wizard and is able to knock out the Human Torch. Unable to fight it directly, Spider-Man is able to find the control panel in its back and smashes the controls, but the Human Torch is still trapped in its grip. He's able to open the hand and then heads back to the controls to find some cartridges of magnetically activated fluid, which he loads into his web shooters. They then find a back entrance, but are coated in a magnetic field. I'm not sure what that's meant to mean, but basically they become magnetised and things start flying at them. Luckily, Spidey picked up that magnetic fluid for his webbing, so the torch burns a hole in the glass barrier, and Spider-Man uses his new magnetic web fluid to reverse the magnetic field. That has the effect of shooting the rocks at the bad guys, destroying their control panel. And that's where the Japanese comic ends. The American comic has a wrap-up page where the Wizard and Mysterio get arrested, and Spider-Man gets a share of the reward money, meaning that he can fly back to New York. Issues 38 to 41 are taken from the Amazing Spider-Man issues 48 and 49, the first appearance of the second Vulture. The biggest difference between the opening pages is that the American version references the previous issue, which featured the return of Kraven the Hunter, whereas the Japanese version just mentions him by name as a potential villain that could be lurking. Oddly enough, this is a story based in the heavy snow of winter, which isn't that strange for the US, considering that it was released in March of 1967, but it was released in September of 1976 in Japan, which is an odd choice when you've only got 10 issues to make an impact on the market, to release a story set in winter in summer. The story follows Spider-Man as he's swinging around trying to get warm, and goes by the prison. Inside is the original Vulture, who's had an accident in the workshop and is dying. He sends for his cellmate, Blackie Drago, so that he can tell him the secret location of the Vulture's wings. But it turns out that it was no accident. Drago had caused the accident in order to find out where the wings were hidden. We then see the Vulture die in the American comic, remembering his battles with Spider-Man. We'll skip past the advert for a child's play nuclear submarine, big enough for 2 children to fit in it, which fires rockets and torpedoes, all for $7, which is still only $65 today, mind you. It doesn't mention anywhere whether it can go in water, however, or whether there's any actual nuclear material, but those are minor details. Actually, I joke, but there was really a kid's atomic energy lab kit from the 50s which genuinely contained uranium, so you never know. But moving on, we then get to Drago's escape as he steals a car and drives out of the jail to find the Vulture's wings and then fly away. Meanwhile, Peter is feeling unwell and goes to a pharmacist where he bumps into Gwen Stacy, or Ngoyen in the Japanese version, which I've undoubtedly mispronounced and I thought was a Vietnamese surname. He's later sent home from school, and we get a page missing from the Japanese version where he's trying to relax at home when J. Jonah Jameson comes on TV complaining about the battle with Kraven in the previous issue. It then moves on to the report about Drago's escape. Drago builds himself a new helmet and then heads out into the city, not to take on Spider-Man like he promised he would, but to cause havoc. Issue 39 has its own intro page, which again seems to be either unique or unused from the American version, and then we get some pages missing in the Japanese version in which Vulture is causing chaos and Peter is struggling with a cold. He even contemplates tagging out and calling Daredevil, referencing an issue where he and Spider-Man teamed up to take down Stiltman. He decides that's not really a good idea and it's his responsibility, and heads out in pursuit. At the same time, Vulture kidnaps a man with a briefcase containing bonds chained to his arm and takes him to the top of the bridge with the intention of throwing him off to break the case open. Spider-Man appears and punches him off the top in order to save the man. All of this is missing from the Japanese version. Instead, the summary page has the man explaining what happened to him, and the blurb talks about how the Vulture has been stealing things from people. It then gets back on track with Spider-Man returning the man to the ground and Vulture attacking, and actually easily overpowering Spider-Man, but then he is unwell. Then MJ turns up at his apartment and speaks with Harry before leaving together to go find Peter. The battle continues with Spider-Man briefly managing to escape the Vulture's clutches, but his illness continues to get worse, and just as he's about to pass out, he's knocked down by the Vulture, and we come to an end of issue 39 and 48 respectively. Issue 40 of Playboy starts where issue 49 of Amazing Spider-Man starts. The Vulture had left Spider-Man to die in the snow, but he manages to wake up. The Japanese version condenses a couple of pages into one, but is essentially the same, with Peter crawling home to get some rest and recover. Meanwhile, Kraven the Hunter has been watching events on TV. He then decides to wrestle a tiger, because of course he does, venting about how he's not happy that there's a new villain in town. Come the morning, Aunt May is bothering Peter about being ill while the Vulture continues his rampage. Again, a few panels are cut, but the story isn't changed. The Vulture attacks a helicopter looking to steal a briefcase full of uncut diamonds, but most of this isn't in the Japanese version. In the American version, Kraven turns up, but he's too late. Either way, he's now caught the scent of the Vulture and he begins to track him. While in Peter's apartment, MJ and Gwen turn up to essentially be annoying and then leave again. There's also a panel about Jameson wanting more pictures of the two villains going at it, but that's cut too. As such, we get back to the main part of the story, with Kraven having hunted down the Vulture, although again, a few panels are missing. Upon hearing of the battle on the radio, Peter decides that he's got to get back out there and sneaks off to join the fight, and also get some pictures. At least, it mentions that in the American version because of the Jonah panel, but that's not present in the Playboy version. We then get into the final issue, number 41, starting right into the action with the battle of Kraven and the Vulture, next to a questionable erotic Tarzan-themed manga, which I can't show you for obvious reasons. The battle continues for a few pages, with the only real interesting thing to note being that Spider-Man mentions that he once made the Hulk stumble with a punch. Now, in both the American and Japanese versions, it says to go read Spider-Man Annual number 3 from 1966, in which you'll find Spider-Man making Hulk stumble with a punch. Which is fine for the American version because it's early 1967 and it's still fairly new, whereas in the Japanese version, it's 10 years old and isn't available in Japanese. Anyway, he manages to beat them both and snap a few pictures to sell to Jonah. In the Japanese version, it just says that he plans to sell them for a high price. It doesn't say to whom, as it hasn't been established that he's a newspaper photographer. He gets back just in time for the Doctor to arrive, which also dates this. When was the last time you got a doctor to come to you at home? You go to A&E here and you might be waiting 8 hours to be seen, never mind staying in bed with the doctor coming to visit you. It all wraps up with Peter being fine and some big bold lettering saying "Next, Spider-Man No More", except there is no next. Spider-Man No More was a specific reference to the next issue of Amazing Spider-Man number 50, again from 10 years prior in the US. But that was the end of Spider-Man's run in Weekly Playboy. So, all in all, once you've got the American issues to compare the pages to Playboy to, it's actually quite obvious where the stories came from, even if tracking them down wasn't easy. Having read through all of the comics now, I'm not really any wiser as to why it failed though. I mean, it is different to the manga style content, and the storylines are compressed down to the bare bones, but they still work. Maybe it's just that they're not fantastical enough for Japanese audiences. I mean, from these particular comics, Kraven is just a very strong hunter, the Vulture is just a guy with a wingsuit, and the Wizard and Mysterio just use trickery. I mean, it's 1976, Japan already has mangas, anime and toku that are far more grand in their fancifulness than the tame by comparison American stories. It's not just the additional dialogue, the stories just don't seem outlandish enough. I enjoyed them as a Westerner, but it's probably not what they wanted. Now, I can't attest to what 40 years of Weekly Playboy has put out, and indeed, I don't even have a full issue from 1976 to see the comics in their full context, but from what I've seen, I just don't buy the narrative that it was the wrong place for it. I mean, as an example, after a lot of trying, and believe me, I mean a lot, because most places won't let you purchase this outside of having a Japanese address, I did manage to get my hands on an e-reader release of the latest issue of Weekly Playboy, and if it's anything like it was 40 years ago, it seems like just the place for a serialized comic. There's everything in it, from food, cars, news and politics, lovely ladies, manga, more lovely ladies, sport, more manga. Hell, the latest issue even has an article about the anniversary of Super Sentai. And don't get it confused, I've often said in my Super Sentai reviews that those shows sometimes contain some odd things for a children's show, only for people to flood the comment section saying it's not just a children's show. But it is still a children's show. The fact that adults also enjoy it is by the by. Here though, it's the other way around. There'll be people saying maybe Spider-Man wasn't the right place because it was taken from a kid's comic book and put in an adult-orientated magazine. And you might have a point, but don't be fooled by the adverts for My First Nuclear Submarine and the old classic X-ray glasses. The American comics also featured ads for land for sale in New Mexico, fitness courses, and hair loss formula. So they were being directly targeted to old and young alike. Granted, some of them were 10 years old by the time they were being reprinted, but I'm reading them an additional 50 years later than that, and I'm still finding them enjoyable enough. To be fair, I don't even know by what metric it was deemed to be a failure. Something I would very much like to ask Gene Pelk about. I can't exactly ask Stan Lee anymore, can I? But that's it. That's the end. But as I say, it's not really a sad story, because they took what they learned and it led to the TV show that spawned all the monster versus giant transforming robot shows that we know and love. So while it was technically a failure, and there's nothing overly unique about the stories themselves, Spider-Man's little foray into Playboy is an important little diversion in the history of the topics that I love to talk about on this channel, and hopefully you love to listen to. But with all that said, I will see you next time.